The fox first appeared on a gray Tuesday morning, sitting just outside the garden gate as if it had been invited. Marianne Holt saw it through the kitchen window while rinsing out her teacup. At first, she thought it was a dog, not because it truly looked like one, but because her mind, at 67 and not yet fully awake, reached first for ordinary explanations. The animal sat so still on the damp stone path beyond the iron gate that it might have been anything from a neighbor's terrier to a heap of russet leaves. Then it lifted its narrow face, and the pale morning light caught the red of its coat and the white under its throat. A fox. Marianne set the cup down slowly. Her cottage stood at the edge of Ashcombe, an old village where gardens pressed close to one another and hedges remembered property lines older than anyone living. She had moved there 28 years earlier with her husband Peter, when they still believed retirement would be longer than it turned out to be. The garden had been the reason she chose the house. Roses climbing the rear wall, an old pear tree by the shed, and a wrought iron gate at the side path opening toward the lane. After Peter died, the garden became less hobby than structure. Things in it needed pruning, tying back, watering, cutting down, and beginning again. It gave the days shape. Now, at 7 in the morning, a fox was sitting at the gate staring into it. Marianne stood at the window longer than she meant to. The fox did not pace, did not paw at the latch. It only watched the lower rose bed to the left of the path, just inside the gate, with an intensity that made her uneasy without quite knowing why. When she finally opened the back door, the fox rose at once, but it did not run far. It backed up 3 or 4 steps into the lane, then stopped and looked at her again. "Shoo," Marianne said, because one says such things even when they are clearly pointless. The fox turned its head once toward the gate, then slipped away behind the hedge. By noon she had nearly forgotten it. Then it came back the next morning, same hour, same place, same stare through the gate. This time Marianne was ready for it. She had already made tea, already opened the curtains, already told herself it would not return, and that her noticing it the first day had made it feel more meaningful than it was. Then there it sat again. She put the kettle down without pouring and went straight to the window. The fox's coat was damp from mist. One ear had a small notch in the edge. Its tail was full but muddied at the tip. It was not starving, not sickly. It looked healthy enough, though perhaps a little thin in the flank the way wild things often do in late autumn. And again it was looking not at the house, not at Marianne, but at the rose bed just inside the gate, at the exact same patch. This time she called over the fence to her neighbor. Mr. Beecham was hanging washing under his covered porch next door, a retired surveyor with the hearing of a suspicious owl and the conversational style of a man who preferred facts to feelings. "Arthur," Marianne said, "there's a fox at my side gate." He looked over, squinted, and shrugged. "Plenty of them this year. This one's been there 2 mornings. Arthur glanced again. "Probably smells bulbs, or mice." "It's staring at the roses." Arthur gave her the sort of look he reserved for unnecessary concern. "Animals stare at all sorts of things." That was true enough. Still, when she went out after breakfast to inspect the rose bed, Marianne found herself moving more carefully than usual. The gate was closed, the latch secure, and the path damp with fallen leaves. The bed beneath the climbing roses looked ordinary at first glance. Mulch darkened by rain, thorny canes tied to the trellis, a few late petals beaten low by weather. Then she noticed the earth. A small patch near the gatepost had been scratched. Not dug deeply, just disturbed. Enough to expose damp soil under the bark mulch. She frowned. Cats had crossed there before. Hedgehogs sometimes rooted about under the bushes. Even badgers, once or twice, though not lately. Still, the marks looked fresh. She went back inside, but the image of the fox and the scratched earth remained with her all day. On Thursday morning, the fox returned for the 3rd time. This time it stood rather than sat. It came closer to the bars of the gate, lowered its head, and scratched once at the ground outside. Then it looked up sharply when Marianne appeared at the window and held her gaze for a second before stepping aside. Marianne felt a prickling along her arms. That was the first moment she thought, absurdly, that the fox wanted her to look there. She hated the thought as soon as it came. People made too much of animals, assigned them messages, meanings, intentions that belonged more to human loneliness than to wildlife. She knew that. She had always known that. Peter had been worse, forever pointing out robins as if they were omens and insisting the cat understood every word said in the house. But still, the fox had returned 3 mornings in a row. The earth was disturbed, and the stare never wavered from that same strip of rosebed by the gate. Marianne did not tell Arthur about that particular thought. He would have smirked, and she was too old to willingly endure smirks before breakfast. Instead, she fetched her gardening gloves and a small hand fork and went out after the fox left. The patch of disturbed ground was slightly larger now. She knelt carefully beside the roses and brushed back the top mulch. The soil beneath was soft, softer than it should have been after a cold night. Marianne dug down perhaps 2 inches before the fork hit something, not stone, something fibrous. She set the tool aside and used her gloved fingers instead, brushing the earth back more gently. A scrap of cloth emerged. Blue, mud-darkened, torn along one edge. Marianne sat back on her heels. For a second, the whole garden seemed to recede around her. The cloth was old enough to be anything: a buried rag, part of an old work shirt, the remnant of some long-forgotten planting sack pushed under by roots and years. That was what she told herself. Then she noticed that the cloth wasn't alone. Something pale lay beneath it, curved, smooth. Her breath caught. She reached in with 2 fingers and cleared more dirt away. Bone, small, not large enough to be a dog, not shaped like the rabbit remains foxes sometimes buried. Human, the mind whispered at once, and she recoiled so violently she nearly toppled backward into the path. For a long moment, Marianne simply stared. The fox was nowhere visible now. The lane beyond the gate was empty. A church bell from the village center struck the quarter hour as if from a great distance. Then she stood, went inside on shaking legs, and called the police. The officer who arrived first was young enough that Marianne immediately distrusted his confidence. Constable Ewan Price parked outside the hedge, took one look at her face, and stopped sounding brisk. "You found bones?" "In the rosebed," Marianne said. "And why were you digging there?" "Because the fox kept coming back." He blinked. The fox? Yes. There was a pause in which both of them understood how ridiculous that sounded. Then Marianne, who had lived too long to care about sounding ridiculous when something beneath her roses might once have been a child, said very clearly, "If you'd like to laugh later, Constable, that's your right, but I'd prefer you look first." To his credit, he did. He crouched where she pointed, pulled on gloves, and examined the exposed patch without touching more than necessary. The change in his face was immediate and gratifyingly free of skepticism. He stood at once and radioed for scenes of crime support. By noon, the side garden of Marianne Holt's cottage was taped off. By evening, half of Ashcombe knew. The official excavation began that afternoon under a gray sky that seemed to press the whole village lower. Neighbors found reasons to walk the lane. Curtains moved. Arthur Beecham crossed over with a casserole he plainly had not made himself, and asked no questions he didn't need answered. Marianne sat in her kitchen with untouched tea while officers in white suits moved around the rosebed with small tools and grave expressions. What they found beneath the roses left the village shaken for years. The bones were human, not a full skeleton, but most of one, small enough to belong to a child. There were scraps of blue fabric, a rusted zipper, one metal shoe buckle, and deeper down a tiny silver bracelet with one letter charm still attached through the corrosion. L. That was what turned memory, because 23 years earlier, a 6-year-old girl named Lucy Harrow had vanished from Ashcombe during the summer fete on the village green. The entire county had searched. The woods, the stream, the quarry road, neighbors' sheds, church lofts, ditches, wells. Everyone had an opinion then. Stranger abduction, family secret. Accident in the woods no one had yet uncovered. Theories bloomed and died with each passing month until the case settled into that particularly cruel category of village history everyone knew and no one could bear to speak of for long. Lucy Harrow, age 6, last seen wearing a blue coat because the weather had turned unexpectedly cold for June. Marianne sat down when the detective superintendent told her the likely connection. No, she said, though not because she believed it false. No. The cottage had belonged then to a different family. The side gate had been wooden, not iron. The rosebed was newer now than the disappearance itself. At some point in the years since, someone had dug there, planted over it, and assumed time would do what time often does for the guilty: soften edges, scatter memory, erase urgency. The village, however, was suddenly remembering everything: who had lived there then, who had rented the cottage after, who had worked on the garden wall one wet autumn 15 years ago, which handyman had been around the fete, which local man had always seemed too interested in children and then moved away quickly the following year, which stories had once seemed wild and now looked different under forensic light. The investigation reopened in full. Old statements were pulled, witnesses re-interviewed, a retired detective consulted. A former groundsman in Dorset was arrested within the month after new evidence linked him to the property and to Lucy's family in ways no one had understood at the time. That part belonged to the police and the courts. What belonged to the village was the fox, because the fox returned the next morning. Marianne saw it through the kitchen window at 7:03, sitting just beyond the police tape, staring at the dugout rosebed. She stood very still. The fox did not run when she came to the window. It looked at the bare earth, then at her, then back again. By now, the whole lane had become alert to unusual things. Arthur saw it too from next door and came to stand beside her in the kitchen without invitation, because some moments make neighbors of anyone close enough to witness them. "Well," he said after a long silence, "I suppose I was wrong." Marianne almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she said, "It wouldn't stop coming." The fox stayed nearly 10 minutes that morning. Then it rose and vanished through the hedge. It came back twice more over the following week while the garden remained part of an active investigation. Each time it paused by the gate, looked in, and left. No one could explain why that unsettled Marianne more than the first sightings had. Perhaps because the worst had already been confirmed. Perhaps because the animal no longer seemed to be calling attention to something hidden, only returning to a place where the hidden had finally been brought to light. Lucy Harrow's mother, now white-haired and thin in the shoulders from years no one should have to survive, came to the lane 2 weeks later after the identification was confirmed beyond doubt. Marianne met her at the gate. Neither woman knew what proper words should sound like under those circumstances, so they began without them. "I'm sorry," Marianne said. Lucy's mother looked past her toward the taped-off bed, the uprooted roses, the dark patch of turned soil. Her face changed in a way Marianne would never forget. Not dramatic, not collapsing, just the expression of a person seeing grief finally step out of uncertainty and into shape. "You found her," she whispered. Marianne shook her head, because somehow that did not feel true enough. "She came back," she said instead, and nodded toward the lane, though the fox was not there just then. The fox, it kept coming back. Lucy's mother closed her eyes briefly, then very softly. "Good." The remains were buried properly in the spring. The whole village attended, including people too young to remember the original disappearance, and old enough now to understand how towns carry unsolved sorrow under daily life like a stone under the tongue. Marianne wore black gloves and sat beside Arthur, who held his hat in both hands through the entire service and cried without embarrassment during the final hymn. Afterward, she went home to a garden that no longer felt entirely hers. The rosebed had been refilled by then, the soil leveled, but she had not replanted it. She couldn't. Not yet. Every time she stood by the gate, she saw the patch of earth as it had been when the cloth first emerged, and the whole weight of the past shifted under her hands. It was Arthur, practical at last when practicality mattered, who said one afternoon, "You can't leave it bare forever." "I know," Then plant something else. Marianne looked at the empty bed. Like what? He shrugged. Something that belongs to children. So in late spring she planted forget-me-nots and white roses, not for symbolism, though of course everyone later said there was symbolism. More because the white roses were hardy and the blue flowers spread low and quietly, and Marianne had grown too tired of thorned red things pretending beauty was enough. The fox appeared one final time in June, a full year after its first visit, almost to the day. Marianne was deadheading the white roses near the gate when she felt, in that old animal way humans sometimes do, that she was no longer alone. She looked up. The fox stood beyond the gate in morning sunlight. The notch in the ear was still there. The coat had gone leaner with summer. Its eyes were clear and untroubled. For a long second, neither moved. Then the fox glanced once toward the replanted bed, turned and trotted down the lane toward the meadow beyond the church wall. It never came back again. Years later, people in Ashcombe still told the story carefully. A fox returned to the same garden gate for days. Then the owner dug beneath the roses. Some called it instinct, some called it chance. Some said foxes know disturbed ground, hidden remains, forgotten things. Some said grief always finds a way up, whether through roots or memory or red paws scratching at the same place until a human finally understands. Marianne herself never argued either way. When asked, she would say only, "It would not let me ignore that corner." And that, in the end, was enough. Because the fox had returned, and returned, and returned, until someone finally looked where no one else had thought to look for 23 years.